your Bibles to John chapter 18. Before I go any further, I want to add a footnote. Because I had several people ask me, how do we know how large that band of men was in verse 3, chapter 18? Well, the honest answer, we'll never know how large this band of men and officers from the chief priests was. The only thing we have to really go on is how many were stationed at the Tower of Antonia. And there always was a heavy presence around the feast days, especially Passover, of Roman soldiers. That's why I said the band of men could have been anywhere from 300 to 600. Maybe it was just 100. I just go on the research from secular sources. I mentioned Gibson in the past, and there's other secular sources. But some Christian sources concerning the arrest of Jesus when he was arrested. It mentions the cohorts. I'll just read you a short little paragraph here. I was going to bring a quite lengthy piece on it, but I don't think it's that necessary. It mentions the cohorts and the officers of the high priest, although cohort can refer to troops of any nation. In this case, it refers to a squad or more of soldiers from the Roman cohort. In Jerusalem, a reference to the cohort, along with the mention of commander of a cohort in John 18:12, makes it clear that Roman troops are present along with the officers of the high priest. Since civil disorder was a possibility at Passover, the high priest decided to request a contingent of Roman troops to support this arrest. Here's another source. I'll just read it real quick. This is really short. What this particular scholar says about a band. The band or cohort was from the Roman garrison in the Tower of Antonia, which, depending on the season, was somewhere between 300 and 600 Roman soldiers. Like I said, we'll never know. But if you read Gibson's work, and it's an encyclopedia of knowledge of the Roman Empire's activities and history, the Romans never did anything in small numbers. They always had an overwhelming presence, especially their army. We would call it today overkill. You don't think for one moment, like I said, after hearing all the stories about Jesus, there was not overkill at that Garden of Gethsemane that evening? Why would they make an exception to the rule? That's why I'm a student of history. Not just biblical history, but secular history. Because you get a flavor, an idea, how the Romans operated, their strategies, techniques, systems, and how they did things. And like I said, they overwhelmingly always had a presence that we would call it today as overkill. Now, do I believe it was 600? It could be. Probably closer to 300. Or maybe even 200. See, around the garden, just in the outskirts, there was many caves. They came with torches and lamps. And maybe next time I'll get to that, what that means. They didn't need everything that they brought with them if they were just going to go to one single location and arrest Jesus. They came prepared for a search and seizure that evening to capture Jesus, to arrest him, and take him back to the high priest and his cronies. So, that's just a footnote. Then I've got a statement and 3 or 4 questions. Some of the questions are similar. But I got a statement from someone. What I found odd is how after being knocked to the ground after Jesus said, "I am," Jesus asked them the same question again and gives the same answer. No reported knockdown on the second round. Of course, this person is referring to John 18, starting with verse 5. They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said unto them, "I am." Echo I me. And Judas also, which betrayed him, stood with them. And soon as he had said unto them, "I am," he's added by the translators, they went backward and fell to the ground. Then asked he them again, "Whom seek ye?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answers, "I have told you that I am. If therefore you seek me, let these go their way." Well, once again, I cannot box God into my rational thoughts, how I would perceive things. And as I mentioned before, Jesus was going to get this mob of soldiers and officers attention. And I tell you my personal opinion, because they didn't come just to arrest Jesus. I believe they came to arrest the few. Not all the disciples was with Jesus, by the way, that evening. The few others that were there. Now, maybe they thought all of them were going to be there, but just a few were there, Peter being one. Can you imagine these arrogant, cocky temple officers or guards, Roman soldiers with their overwhelming force coming in to have their way with Jesus and a few of his disciples? What that might have been like? Even though Jesus gave himself up willingly because that was the will of the Father. He was determined to make sure that his disciples that were with him would not be harmed or arrested at this time. And he got their attention, and we covered that last time. I don't see it odd at all. All you have to do is study the scriptures and see how God has communicated in the past. Take Moses, for instance. Remember, Moses, hotshot in Egypt, the prince of Egypt, downgraded to herding livestock in the backside of the desert for 40 years. Who got out of Egypt with this by the skin of his teeth as a criminal. Now herding livestock. I wonder many times what Moses was thinking all those years after the fact. If the Hebrew God is real, then why my life took a turn to the worst? I was standing up for the Hebrews and God, and next thing you know, I know I'm in the backside of a desert herding livestock. He hasn't heard from God. 40 years go by. He was just living the rest of his life out as a herdsman. How would you get his attention? God chose to get his attention by using a burning bush that didn't burn. And God spoke through that burning bush. I don't know about you, but if God did that to me, I would stop and pay attention. I would proceed towards it to see what it was all about, what was going on. And when I get there, God starts speaking. I'm going, wow. That's something I never experienced before. You would do the same. God had to get Moses' attention, and he chose to do it that way. You comb through the scriptures. Ezekiel. I don't remember the passage now, but it says, "And the hand of the Lord was upon me, and carried me out in the Spirit of the Lord." Try explaining that to someone. How God at that particular time communicated to Ezekiel. Other times, it was just the word of the Lord came to me. But the one I'm referring to was more specific on what happened that particular time to get Ezekiel's attention. And the hand of the Lord was upon me and carried me out in the Spirit of the Lord. You go back to the burning bush. He never used the burning bush after the first time again, as far as we know. Over and over in the scriptures, it says, "And God said to Moses." It never said again, "And God said to Moses through a burning bush." He got Moses' attention with that burning bush. And from that point on, Moses had different type of ears, anticipating what God would say. Because now he's on the same page as God. Look at Daniel. He's another example. He had night visions. He also had day visions. What I'm saying, God got these people's attention using different various ways. I don't think he had to knock him down the second time after he knocked him down the first time. Back to John 18. He got their attention when he announced who he was. And I'm sure he got his disciples' attention also that were with him, because he gave them a pre-warning that would happen. Let's see if I could remember where we could find that verse real quick. Yes, in John 13. After Jesus washes his disciples' feet, verse 18, I speak not of you all, I know whom I have chosen, but that the scripture may be fulfilled. He that eateth bread with me hath lifted up his heel against me. Now I tell you before it come, that when it is to come to pass, ye may believe, pisteo there, you may have trust and confidence that I am. That who? That I am. I am what? God in human flesh that came to be our Savior as promised. He came to fulfill that promise. He is added by the translator, so scratch that out. Now I tell you before it come that when it is to come pass, ye may have believe or trust and confidence that I am. And of course, when he's referring to the I am, you go back to John, and we covered this I think last time. I'm pretty sure we did. Where is that verse? I think it's John. Maybe it's 8:58. When Jesus is speaking to the Jews, he says unto them in verse 58, Jesus said unto them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, before Abraham was, I am. And of course they took up the stones to cast at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple, going through the midst of them, and so passed by, which is still remarkable to me, how he kept always slipping out of the hands of the enemies. But God got their attention that evening at the garden, like I said, by knocking them down on their rear ends. He demonstrated his power. Not to mention, he could call 12 legions of angels, he said. Which, God willing, I'll get to that too. And what that means. So I don't see why it's odd. In fact, this part of the story is not as odd as what I'm going to mention to you here in a few minutes. Then I had another question come in. Good morning, Pastor Joe. Thank you for last night's service. I have a question concerning Jesus when he said, Whom do you seek? The soldier said, Jesus of Nazareth, and Jesus replied, I am. Why do we assume that he is making a declaration to be the great I am? Because he's done it before. As simple as that. Either you take it or leave it. He's done it before. Why do you assume he's making a declaration to the great I am? Which is a title / name to God used in speaking to Moses in Exodus. You don't think the living God in human flesh was not the same God that spoke to Moses? Paul tells us Christ created all things. Did he create all things and then go into non-existent state until he was born in human flesh? You think some of those angel passages came to deliver the children of Israel, or certain situations individuals were in, was really an angel? In some cases, yes. But a lot of cases, it was a pre-incarnated Christ. In my thinking, Jesus was simply answering their inquiry. No, he's doing more than that. Who do you seek? We seek Jesus of Nazareth. He says, I am. Yes, he says, I am. There's no doubt about that. But releasing from that I am statement was his power. And like I said, to get their attention. Don't fall into the trap that all of a sudden these Roman soldiers and temple guards and temple officers and anybody else was there decided to prostrate themselves and acknowledge who he was. Which some have made those stupid declarations. If that's the case, why they proceeded with the arrest? And no one in that Roman cohort and temple officers, if they're acknowledging Jesus as the Son of God, the living God in human flesh, not a single one would have spoke up. Say there's only a few hundred. Not 10 of them would say, no, we're not going to do this. And it'd be at least in one of the 4 records in the gospel. The phrase ego eimi seems to be in my studies a common everyday type usage. Yes, it was. Ego eimi in the Greek was a common usage. It could mean it is. It could mean was. It could mean have been. It could mean a lot of different things. But in context, God was telling the world through these stories that we have here on record that he is the same I am that was speaking to Moses, the same I am that created this universe, the same I am that had this explosive power and force. He really didn't even need 12 legions. He could have done it himself. He proved that by knocking them all on their rear ends. Sometimes you can rationalize your thoughts to the point where you slip from faith into of what is being communicated here. And he goes on to say, people often assume that he is claiming the name I am, but if you go to the next chapter in John 9:9, we read about the blind man who Jesus heals by spitting on mud and making clay. You get to verse 8 and 9, and neighbors were asking, is not this the blind man, etc.? Verse 9, he states, I am. He was added by the translator. Once again, he's not making a statement that he's the I am that spoke to Moses. And like I said, probably the best translation that I've seen of this verse from the closest thing to the original Greek translations that we have is he was responding by saying, it is. He's responding. When they're asking, isn't this the same man that was blind? He responded back, it is. Or, if he was referring to his blindness, I was. But never, I am, in relationship to a God title, let's just call it that, or a God name. And then it goes on to say, was he claiming to be the great I am? No, of course not. How about Acts 10:21? Peter visits Cornelius. Okay, let's go to Acts 21. Then Peter went down to the men which were set upon him from Cornelius and said, Behold, I am he whom ye seek, which is the cause wherefore ye are come. Well, there the he should be in there, because what he's saying is echo eimi hos in the Greek. It could be he or whom, but he's probably the better translation. Behold, I am he. He's referring to himself. He's not referring to himself as a name of God or a title of God. He's just referring to himself as himself. Where else this goes? It's almost identical to Jesus' response to the officers in the garden. No, it's not identical. Not even close. Yes, he uses echo eimi, which was a common phrase they used to identify themselves. The only difference is he was, like I said, not identifying himself as a God. He was just identifying himself as Peter. I think I'm going to only go with there because I'm going to run out of time for where I really want to go tonight. But there's just some of the questions that came in. But if you think this story is odd, or you think this is unbelievable, I never heard it like this before. I've had even people write in and say, I don't know if I could believe this story. I don't know if God would have, or Jesus would have that much power to do what he did that evening, the way you're describing it. Really? That God could raise people from the dead, the God that could heal, doesn't have enough power, a dynamic force to knock people on their rear ends. Well, hell, and hell's right, because that's where those kind of thoughts come from. Even so-called Christians today, healers, evangelistic healers, will knock you down with the Holy Spirit. You could believe that, but you can't believe Jesus could lay someone flat if he chooses to do so. If you can't believe that, then how do you even believe that he came out of the grave? Go to Mark. Mark gives a little bit different insight into what happened that evening. Now I'm jumping in the story because then Peter drew his sword and he chops off either a part or a whole ear itself of an individual standing by near the resting party. And we pick it up in Mark chapter 14. It reads in verse, after Jesus was arrested, in verse 50, and they all forsook him and fled. And there followed him a certain young man, having a linen cloth cast about him naked. And the young man laid hold on him, and he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked. This is another incident that would happen in that garden that that evening. Read that again. Mark's perspective on the story, what happened in that garden, after Jesus was arrested and the other disciples fled and forsook him, and there followed him a certain young man. Who was this young man? Having a linen cloth cast about him naked, and the young man laid hold on him, and he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked. Just around the time that Jesus finished healing the ear of that servant, the high priest, named Malchus, which you go back earlier in the story, in verse 51 and 52, in Mark 14, a naked young man, or almost naked young man, pops up in the scene in the Garden of Gethsemane. Who was this person? Who was this young man? Why was he following Jesus? Why was he almost naked and eventually became naked? Why was he draped in a linen cloth? Why was he not wearing normal clothes like everyone else? And why is this story included in this Garden of Gethsemane scene? If you really think about it, it really doesn't fit in to the events that happened that evening. What is the significance of all this? First, we have to identify this young man, and the key to doing that is look at his clothing that he did have on. Well, the linen cloth that he had draped around his body. That linen cloth, put the word up, in the Greek is sidon. Simply translated linen cloth. You don't find it that many places. Only in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. 4 times it's used. One of the times to depict the linen cloth in which the body of Jesus was wrapped in when he was buried. So the only reference we have for this type of cloth that we find in the New Testament is that it is a burial shroud used for covering dead bodies in the grave. That's it. That's the only reference points we have when we look at the other scriptures. It was a burial cloth. This young man shows up out of nowhere wearing a linen cloth or a burial cloth lightly draped around him. Now, you go into some scholars' opinions and what they wrote about, they think it was a naked young Mark that suddenly showed up because he heard what happened at the garden, and he quickly just wrapped himself up in a burial cloth of all things and raced to the garden to see what he could do or see or be there when something was going down with Jesus. And others think that Mark took off his clothes, and why he was wearing a burial cloth, they can't really explain that, to try to shock and distract the soldiers that are trying to arrest Jesus. Basically, he was streaking, as we would call it today. Once again, it doesn't make any sense. The answer to this naked young man walking around this linen cloth lightly wrapped around his body, is that this man was dead and came back to life. See, so when somebody died, they were prepared for burial. They were washed, ceremonially cleaned, and buried naked in a linen cloth, exactly like it's described here in the story. And I didn't bring it with me. But even today, around that garden, on the particular side of Mount Olives, or Mount of Olives, toward the base of that mount is a heavily populated cemetery. And even today, they could trace back many of those graves going back all the way to Jesus' time. So you have the garden at the base of Mount of Olives. You have the cemetery around that area. So it's a pretty close proximity, the cemetery to where Jesus went to pray before he was taken and arrested. When Jesus said, "I am," we know the power that was released knocked down these band of soldiers and officers, and probably everyone else there, maybe the only exception, his disciples, was so tremendous. Could it possibly affect other things in the story too that we now are looking at? And particularly this young man who all of a sudden just pops up out of nowhere. Could it be that blast of power, when it was released, caused people to rise from the dead? Could this young boy, who was draped in a linen burial cloth, which was the tradition of their time, crawled out of that tomb, raised from the dead? If you don't believe in the resurrection, the story is very strange and odd. But if you believe in a resurrection, and this is your test of faith in the story, this is not impossible. Not impossible at all. How do you think the resurrection of the dead is going to take place? When it does happen in the future. What is the mechanism that causes that? We're just getting a taste of it. And it goes on in the story and says, he followed. In the Greek, it was, once he was resurrected, the word follow, I believe, here means to continuously follow. That's why he trailed behind the soldiers when Jesus was taken from the garden on the way to his trial. Now the soldiers eventually discovered that this young man was following them, so they tried to apprehend him, and he was able to escape from their capture. He broke free and he fled, leaving his linen cloth in their possession, and that's why the story goes on to say he was naked. That's my interpretation of it. We're seeing a different angle of what happened in that garden that evening. This young man just shows up out of nowhere wearing a burial cloth. And the cemetery is just a stone throw away. You need to reflect on the amazing power that was active that evening. The amazing power that was released that evening when Jesus was being arrested in that garden. There was no power that was present that evening that could have withstood Jesus if he had chosen to resist. Jesus was not taken by the will of man. He was delivered by the will of the Father. Which makes it almost unbelievable and amazing and marvelous that Jesus freely gave up his life for you and for me. No one had sufficient enough power to take him by force. He willingly laid down his life for you and me. That's the God we serve. That's the God we worship. That's the God we follow. And like I said, if you think it was odd what happened prior to the arrest, then this story slips in. That should have you really scratching your head, especially if you don't believe in a resurrection. God knows how many more people were raised from the dead. We know when he came out of that tomb, resurrected dead was noticed around Jerusalem. These are not fable stories. This is the power of the resurrection power that only could be released through by a true living God. Not a false God, not a pretend God, not a fake God, but the only true living God. And that God lived in human flesh for our sake, for our benefit. And his name was Jesus. Now I want to hear from you. Play a song.